"You're not in the will, Margaret." "My father made sure of that," my daughter-in-law said quietly, as if she were commenting on the weather. I remember the exact shade of the carpet in the attorney's office when she said it. A dull beige with tiny blue threads running through it, the kind of pattern meant to disappear so people could focus on serious conversations. But in that moment it was the only thing I could look at. My eyes stayed on that carpet while the room went completely still around me. "My name is Margaret Caldwell. I'm 68 years old, and until that morning I believed I had raised my son to be the kind of man who would never sit silently while someone erased his mother from the story of her own life." The lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, his voice careful and professional as he explained the details of my late husband Daniel's estate. The words floated past me like distant traffic. Assets. Distribution. Property holdings. Investment accounts. Each phrase sounded heavier than the last, yet none of them seemed to include me. Across the table, my son Ethan stared down at his folded hands. He had Daniel's broad shoulders and the same dark hair, though his had started graying at the temples. When he was 6 years old he used to run across our backyard in Columbus, Ohio, holding a toy airplane above his head and shouting that one day he'd fly us somewhere warm. I wondered if he remembered that. I wondered if he remembered the woman who packed his lunches and waited up when he missed curfew. Beside him sat his wife, Brooke. Brooke always dressed like she expected to be photographed. Even today, at a meeting about a will, she wore a pale cream blazer and a delicate gold necklace that caught the light every time she turned her head. When the lawyer finished explaining the structure of the estate, Brooke leaned back slightly in her chair and gave a small, satisfied breath. It wasn't loud. If you weren't paying attention you might not have noticed it. But I did. The lawyer finally looked up from the document. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said carefully, "Daniel's most recent revision places the primary residential property and the majority of the financial assets under Ethan's management." Under Ethan's management. I noticed the phrasing. Not ownership. Management. That difference lingered quietly in the air, though no one else seemed to hear it. Brooke spoke before I could say a word. "It's really for the best," she said smoothly. "The house is a lot for one person to handle." I still didn't look up from the carpet. I had lived in that house for 37 years. I knew every creak in the hallway floor and every stubborn cabinet hinge in the kitchen. But according to the document sitting on that polished oak table, the house now belonged to a future that apparently did not include me. Ethan shifted in his chair. For a moment I thought he might speak. Instead he simply nodded once, the way people do when they want a conversation to move along quickly. The lawyer slid the folder across the table toward him. Papers rustled. Pens clicked. Brooke's phone lit up for a moment before she turned it face down again. Everything about the room felt orderly and polite. No raised voices. No slammed doors. Just quiet decisions being accepted as if they had always been obvious. That was when Brooke said the sentence I would remember long after the details of the meeting faded. "Daniel wanted things to be simple," she said, glancing briefly in my direction. "And he knew Ethan would take care of everything." Simple. I finally lifted my eyes from the carpet. Through the office window I could see a gray November sky hanging over the parking lot. A cold wind pushed a line of dry leaves across the asphalt. It was the kind of day Daniel used to spend fixing something in the garage while I made soup in the kitchen. 37 years of marriage reduced to a quiet morning and a folder full of signatures. I stood slowly, smoothing the sleeves of my coat. No one tried to stop me. No one even asked where I was going. "Mrs. Caldwell," the lawyer said politely as I reached the door. I gave him a small smile. "Thank you for your time." Outside, the air smelled like rain and fallen leaves. I walked past Ethan's SUV, past Brooke's polished sedan, and across the lot toward the small brick bank on the corner of the street. My hands were steady as I pushed open the glass door. Because if there was one thing Daniel Caldwell had always taught me during our 37 years together, it was this: never assume the first version of the story is the whole story. The bank lobby was warm compared to the cold November wind outside, and for a moment I simply stood there letting the quiet settle around me. A young teller behind the counter looked up and smiled politely, the kind of polite smile you see 100 times a day and never remember. I had walked into that same bank for more than 20 years, usually with Daniel beside me on Saturday mornings after we finished grocery shopping. We used to joke that the place smelled like coffee and fresh paper, and standing there now I realized it still did. Nothing in that room had changed. The same marble floor. The same tall windows facing the street. The same faint hum of printers and quiet conversations. But everything inside me felt different. I approached the counter slowly and asked if the bank manager was available. The teller nodded and disappeared through a door behind the offices. A minute later a man stepped out adjusting the sleeve of his jacket. His name was Thomas Reed. Daniel had trusted him with nearly every financial decision we made during the last decade. When he saw me he offered a sympathetic expression. Everyone in town had heard about Daniel's passing. It had been 2 weeks since the funeral. 2 weeks since the casseroles stopped arriving and the phone calls slowly faded. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said gently, extending his hand. "I am very sorry for your loss." I thanked him and followed him into his office. The room was small but comfortable, with a wooden desk, 2 chairs, and a framed photograph of a fishing boat hanging on the wall. Daniel had once spent half an hour discussing that photograph with him, debating whether the boat was from the coast of Maine or somewhere farther south. Sitting there now, I remembered how easily Daniel made friends with people. Thomas folded his hands on the desk and waited for me to speak. For a moment I simply looked at the sunlight coming through the window beside him. It fell across the desk in a pale rectangle. Finally I said, "Daniel and I kept a safety deposit box here." Thomas nodded. "Yes, you do." Do. Present tense. The word caught my attention immediately. I leaned forward slightly. "I would like to review the contents." Thomas turned his computer monitor toward himself and typed for a moment. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not alarmed, not surprised, just thoughtful. "Of course," he said. "Both your name and Daniel's name are listed on the box. You have full access." Full access. Another small phrase that seemed to echo louder than it should have. We walked down a quiet hallway toward the vault room. The walls were lined with framed certificates and photographs of the bank from decades earlier. I had walked that same hallway with Daniel several times, usually while he talked about interest rates or retirement plans that seemed impossibly far away at the time. Inside the vault room the air felt cooler. Rows of metal boxes covered the walls like a grid of tiny doors. Thomas retrieved a narrow metal drawer and placed it carefully on the table in the center of the room. "Take all the time you need," he said before stepping back toward the door. When he left, the heavy vault door closed with a quiet metallic click. I sat down at the table and opened the box slowly. Inside were several neatly organized envelopes, a few documents in protective sleeves, and one small leather notebook that I immediately recognized as Daniel's. My husband was a careful man. He believed in writing things down, labeling folders, leaving instructions that made life easier for the people who came after him. I picked up the notebook and turned the first page. His handwriting was steady and familiar, the same handwriting that had filled birthday cards and grocery lists for nearly 4 decades. My chest tightened as I read the first sentence he had written there months earlier. "If you are reading this, Maggie, it means something has not gone the way I expected." I sat perfectly still in that quiet vault room with the notebook open in my hands, and for the first time since the lawyer's office that morning, I felt something shift deep inside me. Because Daniel Caldwell had never been careless with his plans, and the words written on that page suggested that somewhere along the way, someone had tried to change them. I remained seated in the quiet vault room for a long moment after reading Daniel's first sentence, my hands resting on the small leather notebook as if it were something fragile. Daniel had always believed in preparation. During our 37 years of marriage, he had a habit of planning for situations most people never considered. When our old furnace failed during a winter storm 15 years ago, he already had the number of a repair company taped inside the kitchen cabinet. When Ethan went off to college, Daniel had quietly opened a savings account in his name that even I had not known about until the tuition bills arrived. That was the kind of man my husband was. Calm, careful, and always 2 steps ahead of trouble. I turned the page slowly and continued reading. Daniel's handwriting remained steady and clear across the paper. I have updated several documents during the past year, he wrote. If anyone ever tells you that you have been left with nothing, it means the wrong version of those documents has been presented. I felt the faintest chill run through me as I read those words. Wrong version. Daniel continued explaining that he had stored copies of important records in several locations, including the safety deposit box where I was sitting now. Beneath the notebook lay 3 sealed envelopes, each labeled carefully in his familiar script. One read financial records. Another read property documents. The third envelope was smaller, and the label simply said for Maggie. I stared at that envelope for a few seconds before picking it up. The paper felt slightly thicker than a normal letter envelope, and Daniel had sealed it with the same careful precision he used when sending holiday cards to our relatives in Michigan. I opened it slowly and unfolded the letter inside. The date at the top was from 8 months earlier, back when Daniel still insisted on mowing the lawn himself even though I told him the riding mower was too heavy for him to handle. Maggie, the letter began, if you are reading this, it means someone may be trying to convince you that you have no place in the life we built together. That will not be true. My throat tightened as I continued reading. Daniel explained that during the last year of his illness he had become concerned about certain conversations he overheard between Ethan and Brooke regarding the house and the estate. He wrote that he did not believe Ethan intended harm, but that he worried Ethan had begun trusting the wrong guidance. Daniel did not accuse anyone directly. That was never his style. Instead, he described the steps he had taken to protect the future he wanted for me. According to the letter, the official will filed with the attorney was only one piece of a larger structure Daniel had created. Several financial accounts were set up in a way that required my authorization before any major property decision could take place. The house itself had been placed under a legal arrangement that Daniel believed would prevent it from being sold without my approval. As I read the final lines of the letter, a strange calm began to settle over me. The shock I felt in the lawyer's office that morning started to fade, replaced by a quiet realization that Daniel had anticipated this moment long before it happened. I returned the letter carefully to the envelope and then opened the larger folder labeled property documents. Inside were copies of deeds, trust agreements, and several pages of legal language that I did not fully understand yet but recognized as important. One page in particular caught my attention. It carried Daniel's signature and a date from only 4 months before he passed away. Beneath the signature was a statement that made my heart beat just a little faster. The document clearly stated that no transfer or sale of the Caldwell residence could occur without the written consent of Margaret Caldwell. I leaned back slowly in the chair and looked around the quiet vault room again. The metal walls, the fluorescent lights, the faint sound of footsteps somewhere outside the heavy door. For the first time since that morning, I allowed myself a small breath of relief. Because the version of the story I heard at the attorney's office was not the whole story after all. And somewhere above me in that gray Ohio afternoon, my son and his wife were probably still very confident that everything had gone exactly the way they expected. I closed the safety deposit box slowly and sat there for a moment with Daniel's notebook resting in my hands. The quiet inside that vault felt different now. Earlier it had felt heavy, almost suffocating, the kind of silence that follows bad news. But now it felt steady, like the calm that comes when a puzzle piece finally clicks into place. Daniel had not been a man who panicked when problems appeared. He studied them carefully, the way he used to study blueprints when he was working construction projects in his younger years. He believed that every situation had a structure, and once you understood that structure, you understood how everything would eventually unfold. I gathered the documents carefully and returned them to their envelopes, leaving Daniel's letter folded inside my coat pocket. When I stepped out of the vault room, Thomas Reed looked up from his desk with a polite expression. "Everything all right, Mrs. Caldwell?" he asked gently. I gave a small nod. "Yes, thank you. I just needed to review a few things." He did not press further. Bank managers learn very quickly when to ask questions and when to let people leave with their thoughts. Outside, the sky had darkened slightly, the kind of pale gray Ohio afternoon that always reminded me winter was close. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. Daniel's voice seemed to echo quietly in my memory, not as a sound but as a feeling. He had always trusted patience more than confrontation. If something was wrong, he believed the best response was to observe carefully until the truth revealed itself. The drive home took 15 minutes. I passed the grocery store where Daniel used to insist on choosing the produce himself, carefully squeezing each tomato as if he were selecting rare gemstones. I passed the small diner on the corner where we had eaten breakfast nearly every Sunday for 10 years. By the time I turned onto our street, the houses looked exactly the same as they had for decades. Brick driveways. Maple trees along the sidewalks. The quiet rhythm of a neighborhood that rarely changed. Ethan's SUV was already parked in the driveway when I pulled in behind it. Through the kitchen window I could see Brooke moving around the counter, her phone balanced between her shoulder and ear while she spoke to someone in a low voice. She ended the call quickly when she noticed my car. When I stepped inside the house, the warmth of the heating system wrapped around me along with the familiar smell of lemon cleaning spray. Brooke stood near the sink with a bright expression that appeared almost rehearsed. "Margaret, you are back already," she said pleasantly. "We were wondering where you went after the meeting." I set my purse on the small table beside the door and removed my coat slowly. "I needed to run an errand," I replied calmly. Ethan walked in from the living room a moment later, his expression uncertain. He looked as if he had rehearsed something to say but had forgotten the lines halfway through. "Mom, about earlier," he began carefully. "Brooke and I were thinking it might be easier if we started discussing some long-term plans for the house." I noticed Brooke watching my face very closely, as if she expected some kind of emotional reaction. Perhaps she imagined I would protest or argue or demand explanations about the will. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. The faucet ran for a few seconds before I turned it off again. "That sounds reasonable," I said quietly. Ethan blinked in surprise. Brooke's shoulders relaxed almost immediately, the way people relax when they believe a difficult conversation has just become simple. "Exactly," she said with a quick smile. "The house is large and maintenance can be overwhelming for one person. We were thinking that maybe after the holidays we could look into selling it." I took a slow sip of water and set the glass down carefully on the counter. "After the holidays," I repeated. Brooke nodded, clearly satisfied with that answer. But as I stood there in the kitchen Daniel and I had shared for nearly 4 decades, I could feel the folded letter resting quietly in my coat pocket, and the words he had written earlier that year seemed to settle into my thoughts like steady ground beneath my feet. Because Daniel had never left important things unfinished, and the people standing in front of me had no idea that the story they believed had already begun to change. I slept very little that night. The house was quiet in the way it always becomes after midnight, when the refrigerator hum sounds louder than it should and every small movement of the old floorboards echoes through the hallway. For 37 years Daniel and I had shared that house together, and every room still carried the rhythm of our life. His reading chair was still beside the living room window. His favorite coffee mug still sat on the second shelf in the kitchen cabinet. Even his worn brown jacket still hung on the hook near the back. door where he had left it the last time he walked out to check the mail. I sat at the kitchen table long after Ethan and Brooke had gone upstairs, Daniel's letter open in front of me again beneath the soft yellow light above the stove. I read it slowly for the third time that evening, paying attention to the small details in his handwriting. Daniel had always written the same way he spoke. Calm. Direct. Thoughtful. There was nothing emotional or dramatic in the letter. Instead, it was filled with quiet instructions and observations. He mentioned conversations he had overheard months earlier when Brooke thought he was asleep in the living room. He wrote about the way certain financial questions had started appearing more frequently, especially questions about the value of the house and the timeline for transferring ownership. Daniel did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing in the letter, but he clearly suspected that someone was trying to move pieces on the board before the game was finished. Around 2 in the morning I folded the letter carefully and returned it to my coat pocket. Then I walked slowly down the hallway toward Daniel's old study. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open. That room had always been his space, filled with the quiet order he preferred. The oak desk stood near the window, and the tall bookshelf behind it still held the same binders he used to organize everything from insurance records to tax statements. I sat down in his chair and looked across the desk toward the opposite wall where he had pinned a small calendar earlier that year. The last month marked on it was April. That was the month his doctor told us the treatments were no longer working. I opened the top drawer of the desk and found exactly what I expected to see. Several folders labeled in Daniel's careful handwriting. Property taxes. Insurance policies. Retirement accounts. Everything arranged with the same precision he had always used. But beneath those folders sat something new. A thin gray binder that I did not recognize. I pulled it out slowly and placed it on the desk. On the front cover Daniel had written a simple title in black ink. Estate structure. The pages inside contained copies of documents I had already seen in the safety deposit box earlier that day, along with additional notes. Daniel had written beside certain paragraphs. Some of those notes explained the purpose behind specific legal arrangements he had created during the past year. One note beside a highlighted section caught my attention immediately. In the margin Daniel had written a short sentence that made me pause. If they believe the house belongs only to Ethan, they will eventually reveal their intentions. I leaned back in the chair and stared at that sentence for a long moment. Daniel had not written that line as a guess. He had written it as part of a plan. Downstairs I heard the faint sound of Brooke's footsteps moving across the kitchen floor, followed by the quiet click of the refrigerator door opening. She was probably getting a glass of water before returning to bed, completely unaware that I was sitting in Daniel's study reading the final pieces of a puzzle he had carefully assembled months before he passed away. A few seconds later the house became quiet again. I closed the binder gently and returned it to the desk drawer. Then I switched off the desk lamp and walked back into the dark hallway. Because if Daniel Caldwell had spent the last year preparing for this situation, the worst thing I could do now was reveal that I knew it. The next morning the house smelled faintly of coffee and toasted bread, the same quiet routine that had started most of our mornings for decades. I woke early, long before Ethan and Brooke came downstairs, and stood by the kitchen window watching the pale Ohio sunrise push through the thin branches of the maple trees in the backyard. Daniel used to say that mornings were when people revealed their true intentions, because it was the one time of day when no one had fully prepared their performance yet. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the folded letter from Daniel resting inside my robe pocket. For a long time I simply listened to the small sounds of the house waking up. The heating vents clicked softly. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked as someone moved across the hallway. A few minutes later Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway. His hair was slightly disheveled and he still wore the gray sweatshirt he often slept in. For a moment he looked almost like the boy who used to wander into the kitchen before school asking if there were pancakes. "Morning, Mom," he said cautiously. "You are up early." I nodded and slid the coffee pot toward him. Old habits, I replied. Your father always liked breakfast before 7. Ethan poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter, staring into the mug as if he expected it to offer answers. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. Brooke mentioned that you seemed surprisingly calm yesterday, he said carefully. After the meeting. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. Your father and I discussed many possibilities over the years, I said. Very little surprises me anymore. Ethan nodded, though his expression suggested he did not fully understand what I meant. A moment later Brooke entered the kitchen, already dressed neatly for the day with her hair pulled back and her phone in one hand. She greeted Ethan with a quick smile before turning toward me. Margaret, I spoke with a real estate agent this morning, she said, her tone bright and efficient. Just to explore options. Nothing official yet, of course. I set my cup down gently. That sounds productive, I said. Her eyes searched my face briefly, perhaps looking for resistance or concern. When she found neither, her shoulders relaxed slightly. The market is still strong in this neighborhood, she continued. Houses like this can sell very quickly if they are priced correctly. Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside the counter but did not interrupt her. I watched them both quietly, noticing the small details Daniel had once told me never to ignore. The way Brooke spoke as if decisions had already been made. The way Ethan avoided direct eye contact whenever the future of the house was mentioned. Daniel had written in the margin of his binder that if certain people believed they had control of the situation, they would eventually reveal their true plans without realizing it. So I nodded thoughtfully and asked a simple question. When were you thinking of listing the house? Brooke's expression brightened immediately, as if she had just received confirmation of something she hoped for. After the holidays would be ideal, she said. That gives us time to prepare everything properly. Prepare everything properly. I repeated the phrase quietly in my mind. Daniel had always said that patience was the most powerful tool a person could use in complicated situations. The people who rushed were usually the ones who revealed too much too soon. I finished my coffee and stood from the table. That timeline makes sense, I said calmly. Brooke smiled, clearly satisfied with the direction of the conversation. Ethan looked relieved as well, as though a tension he expected had never appeared. But as I walked down the hallway toward the living room, I could feel the weight of Daniel's folded letter still resting in my pocket, and the quiet certainty in his handwriting echoed again in my thoughts. Because the people in that kitchen believed they were planning the future of this house, and they had no idea that the rules of the game had already been written long before yesterday's meeting ever began. I spent the rest of that afternoon moving through the house the same way I had for years, slowly and deliberately, as if nothing had changed. The living room windows were open just slightly, letting in the cool autumn air and the faint sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. Our neighborhood had always been predictable that way. People trimmed their hedges on Saturdays, children rode bicycles along the sidewalks, and every evening the porch lights flickered on one by one as the sun disappeared behind the maple trees. To anyone passing by, the Caldwell house probably looked exactly the same as it had for decades. But inside those walls, the balance of the story had begun to shift in a way no one else could see yet. Brooke spent most of the afternoon at the kitchen counter with her laptop open, speaking on the phone in the calm, efficient tone she used whenever she believed she was organizing something important. I could hear parts of the conversation drifting down the hallway while I folded laundry in the bedroom. She mentioned square footage, renovation potential, property values in our area of Columbus. Each phrase was delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the house already belonged to her future plans. Ethan moved in and out of the rooms without much direction, occasionally glancing toward Brooke as if waiting for instructions he did not realize he was following. Around 3 in the afternoon I stepped into the kitchen to pour another cup of tea. Brooke ended her call the moment she noticed me and closed the laptop halfway. I was just speaking with the real estate agent again, she said smoothly. She believes the property could attract serious offers very quickly. I nodded politely and set the kettle back on the stove. That sounds promising, I replied. Brooke watched my face for a moment, searching for the same reaction she had been waiting for since yesterday. Disappointment. Protest. Confusion. When none of those appeared, she gave a satisfied little smile and reopened her laptop. Later that evening, Ethan joined me on the back porch while the sun sank low behind the trees. The wooden boards beneath our chairs still creaked in the same familiar places Daniel used to joke about fixing every summer. Ethan rested his elbows on his knees and stared out at the yard where he had spent most of his childhood. Mom, he said quietly, I hope you understand that Brooke and I are just trying to make practical decisions. I studied his face carefully before answering. Ethan had always been a thoughtful child, the kind who apologized if he accidentally stepped on someone's foot in a crowded hallway. But now there was a certain uncertainty in his eyes, the look of someone who had begun following a road without noticing exactly where it led. Your father believed in practical decisions too, I said calmly. Ethan nodded slowly, though I could tell he was not entirely sure what that meant. Inside the house, Brooke's voice drifted faintly through the open kitchen window as she spoke on the phone again. This time her tone carried a note of quiet excitement. Yes, she was saying, once the paperwork is finalized everything should move quickly. Ethan did not seem to notice those words, but I did. Daniel had once written in the margin of that gray binder that people reveal the most when they believe the outcome is already guaranteed. I stood from the porch chair and brushed a few dry leaves from my sweater. I am going to take a short walk, I told Ethan. He nodded absently, still looking out across the yard. The evening air had turned cooler by the time I reached the sidewalk. Streetlights flickered on one by one along the quiet row of houses. As I walked past the neighbor's mailbox, I slipped Daniel's folded letter from my pocket and read the final sentence again beneath the yellow glow of the street lamp. His handwriting remained steady even in that last line. If the time ever comes when the truth must surface, he had written, allow them to believe their plan is working until the very moment it no longer is. I folded the letter again and continued walking slowly down the street, because somewhere behind me in that quiet brick house my son and his wife believed the future had already been decided, and the only thing left now was to give them enough time to show exactly how they planned to claim it. I returned home just as the last light of evening settled over the neighborhood, the kind of quiet blue hour that always made the street look softer than it did during the day. The porch light beside our front door was already on. Brooke had probably switched it on the moment the sun dipped behind the trees. She liked the house to look welcoming from the outside, the way homes appear in real estate brochures where every detail seems carefully arranged. When I stepped inside, the faint sound of her voice drifted from the living room again. She was speaking on the phone, her tone calm but energetic, the way people speak when they believe progress is unfolding exactly the way they planned. I hung my coat on the same wooden hook Daniel had installed 20 years earlier and walked quietly down the hallway. Brooke's words became clearer as I approached the doorway. Yes, we should be ready soon, she was saying. The property will not stay available long once it is listed. I paused only long enough to recognize the quiet certainty in her voice before continuing toward the kitchen as if I had not heard a thing. Ethan sat at the dining table scrolling through something on his tablet. When he saw me, he looked up with the same uncertain expression he had worn most of the week. You took a long walk, he said. I filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove before answering. The air was nice this evening. Ethan nodded slowly, but I could see a question lingering in his eyes that he did not quite know how to ask. Brooke ended her call and joined us a moment later, her expression bright and composed. Margaret, I have been reviewing some numbers with the agent, she said, pulling out a chair at the table. If everything lines up correctly, we could have the house prepared for listing sooner than expected. I turned off the kettle just as it began to hum and poured hot water into my cup. Sooner than expected? I repeated gently. Brooke smiled. Perhaps within a few weeks. The sooner buyers see it, the better the outcome usually is. Ethan looked between us as if he were waiting for some form of disagreement that never came. Instead, I stirred my tea slowly and nodded. Preparation is important, I said. Brooke's shoulders relaxed again, the same small signal of confidence I had noticed earlier that day. She believed the conversation was moving in the direction she wanted. Later that night, after the house grew quiet again and Ethan and Brooke had gone upstairs, I returned to Daniel's study. The gray binder still rested in the desk drawer exactly where I had placed it the night before. I opened it again beneath the soft desk lamp and reread several of Daniel's notes. Each page reflected the same careful thinking he had always applied to everything in his life. In the margins he had written observations about timing, documentation, and something he called confirmation of intent. One note stood out more clearly than the others. If they attempt to move forward too quickly, he had written, it will create the very evidence needed to stop them. I closed the binder slowly and leaned back in Daniel's chair. Somewhere upstairs a door closed softly and the faint sound of footsteps crossed the hallway. Brooke and Ethan were probably discussing the next steps of the plan they believed was already in motion. Perhaps they were even imagining the future they expected to build once the house changed hands. But Daniel had spent nearly a year arranging the structure that protected this place, and every decision he made was designed for moments exactly like this one. I turned off the desk lamp and stood quietly in the dark room for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the soft glow from the hallway light. Because patience, Daniel had always said, reveals more truth than confrontation ever will. And somewhere inside that quiet house, the people who believed they controlled the outcome were beginning to move faster than they realized. The following morning arrived quietly, wrapped in the pale gray light that always seemed to settle over Columbus in late autumn. I woke before anyone else again, the way I had every day since the meeting at the attorney's office, and walked slowly through the hallway toward the kitchen. The house still carried that familiar early morning stillness, the kind that made every sound more noticeable. The coffee maker clicked softly as it warmed. The clock above the stove ticked in steady seconds. For a moment I simply stood there, resting my hand on the back of one of the wooden chairs Daniel had built himself years earlier. 37 years of life had happened in that kitchen. Birthdays. Sunday breakfasts. Late-night conversations about Ethan's future. Daniel used to say that houses remember things long after people forget them. I poured a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, watching the pale sunlight spread slowly across the floorboards. A few minutes later Brooke came downstairs dressed in a light gray blazer, already holding her phone as if the day had been waiting for her to begin directing it. She paused when she saw me at the table. "You are up early again," she said pleasantly. I nodded and lifted my coffee cup. Old habits are difficult to change. She smiled and opened the refrigerator, pulling out a small container of yogurt. For a moment the kitchen filled with the quiet sounds of spoons and cabinet doors. Then she spoke again in the casual tone she used whenever she believed progress was unfolding exactly as planned. "The real estate agent called again this morning," she said. "She wants to visit the house later this week to take measurements and photographs." I set my cup down slowly. "Photographs?" Brooke nodded enthusiastically. "Professional listing photos. That way everything is ready when we move forward." A few seconds passed before Ethan appeared in the doorway, still adjusting the sleeves of his shirt as he walked into the room. "Morning," he said, glancing between the two of us. Brooke repeated the update immediately, explaining the agent's plan with the same confidence she had used in every conversation that week. Ethan listened quietly, nodding occasionally as if he were trying to convince himself that the situation had already settled into a natural direction. When she finished speaking, both of them looked toward me. I could almost feel the unspoken expectation in the room. They were waiting to see whether I would object. Whether I would remind them that the house had belonged to Daniel and me long before either of them had ever stepped through the front door. Instead, I lifted my coffee cup again and took a slow sip. If the agent needs to visit, that should be fine, I said calmly. Brooke's relief was almost immediate. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair as if a tension he had been bracing for had quietly dissolved. For the rest of the morning Brooke moved through the house with renewed energy, opening closets and measuring walls while speaking softly into her phone. From the living room I could hear her describing the property again. The square footage. The backyard. The quiet neighborhood that made the location desirable for new buyers. Every sentence carried the same quiet assumption that the house would soon belong to someone else. Around noon I stepped outside onto the back porch. The maple leaves scattered across the yard rustled softly in the wind. Daniel used to sit on that porch during autumn afternoons with a newspaper folded beside him, watching the same trees change color year after year. I slipped my hand into my coat pocket and felt the familiar shape of the folded letter he had written months earlier. His words had guided every decision I had made since reading them. Allow them to believe their plan is working. I looked back toward the kitchen window where Brooke was moving from room to room with a measuring tape in her hand, her phone pressed between her shoulder and ear as she spoke excitedly about listing dates and buyer interest. Ethan followed behind her quietly, carrying a notepad and writing down the numbers she called out. They moved through the house with the confidence of people who believed the outcome had already been decided. But Daniel had never been careless with the life we built together, and as the cool afternoon wind moved across the porch I realized something very clearly. The moment they tried to move forward with those plans would be the moment everything they believed about this house would begin to fall apart.